Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our Facebook Live conversation about the Kindertransport. At the end of the session, you'll have the opportunity to type in some questions, and I would like to mention that this technology is new for us. So if we do encounter any technical difficulties, please bear with us and please stay with us. My name is Michele Gold, and I'm a docent and author of Memories That Won't Go Away and the board chair of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. We are the oldest survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States, commemorating those who perished, honoring those who survived, and educating generations of students. Every day we are inspired to continue our goal of teaching our students and our educators and our communities the lessons of the Holocaust, to guard against racism and discrimination in all of its destructive forms, and to ensure our future generations live in a world of dignity and humanity. Joining us today are two exceptional women. Barbara Winton. Barbara is the daughter of world-renowned rescuer Sir Nicholas Winton. Sir Nicholas Winton brought 669 children to safety, and these children became known as the Winton Children. And we are also privileged to have joining us Amanda Susskind, Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League in Los Angeles. Amanda is the daughter of Charles Susskind, a Kindertransport survivor and likely to have been a Winton child. He was on one of the last Kindertransport trains that left Czechoslovakia in August of 1939, just a few weeks before his 18th birthday. For those of us listening who may not be quite so familiar with the Kindertransport was a rescue mission that was put together within 3 weeks after the statewide terror of Kristallnacht that occurred on November 9th and 10th of 1938. Kristallnacht means the night of the broken glass, and it was given this name because over these two nights, hundreds of Jewish homes had their windows smashed and their shop fronts and storefronts smashed, and there was so much glass everywhere that it was called Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. In addition to this, Nazi mobs torched or otherwise vandalized hundreds of synagogues and damaged, if not destroyed, thousands of Jewish homes, schools, businesses, and hospitals. Nearly 100 Jews were murdered in the violence. Nazi officials ordered German police officers and firemen to do nothing as the riots raged and buildings burnt, although firefighters were instructed to extinguish blazes that threatened Aryan-owned property. I often refer to Kristallnacht as the precursor, the turning point of what was to come. After Kristallnacht, the persecution of Jews became more organized. Jewish people knew they were in danger and they were very nervous. They were nervous for themselves, but much more so for their children. A visionary plan was hurriedly put together in England by the Central British Fund for German Jewry, which was established in 1933 and is now known as World Jewish Relief. Together with dedicated volunteers, Christians, Quakers, refugee agencies, and influential leaders who all came together to help fund the operation. The plan was to be called the Refugee Children's Movement, later known as the Kindertransport, the Children's Transport. All these leaders and organizations came together to lobby Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his government, and it was decided within 3 weeks that England would open their doors to all the children ranging from infants up to the age of 17 years of age. Great Britain waived immigration requirements so as to allow entry to the unaccompanied children without passports or visas, with no restrictions. The only condition put upon these children was that every child would have a guarantee of 50 sterling pounds, which is about 60 USA dollars. Back in 1938, $68, 50 sterling pounds or 60 USA dollars was a great deal of money. So if you didn't have it, you had to raise it quickly. The monetary requirement was so each child coming into the UK would not be a burden to the state, and because it was thought that after the war, all the children would be reunited with their parents and their families. However, only some of the children were reunited with their parents, many of whom had suffered the war in hiding or in Nazi concentration camps. The first train left from Berlin on December 1st of 1938 with about 200 children who traveled together but alone. Between December 1st of 1938 and September 1st of 1939, most of the transports left from Berlin, Vienna, Prague, Hamburg, Danzig, and other major cities. The last known transport of Kinder left from the Netherlands on the 14th of May of 1940, the day the Dutch army surrendered to Germany. My mother was 15 years old when she left her home in Leipzig, Germany, to board the Kindertransport. In her memoir, she wrote about the heartache she felt saying goodbye to her parents and how outwardly she knew she had to remain strong. She boarded the train, and that was the last time she ever saw her brave parents. She wrote how it was only many years later, as a parent herself, that she fully understood what the parting had meant to them. I never knew my grandparents because they were taken, and so were most of my family. My mother often said that if Israel had existed in the 1930s, her parents would not have been murdered by the Nazis, and her childhood would not have been taken from her. She understood that few countries were there to offer sanctuary to the Jews of Europe who had nowhere to go, and she always remained grateful to Great Britain for the lifeline that she was given. To a large extent, the Kindertransport was about the strength and bravery of the parents who separated themselves from their children, knowing they would most likely never see their children again. The younger children had no idea why they were being sent away. The older children, like my mother, had a better understanding, and they had to cope with the fear of what their loved ones were facing. Children struggled to maintain contact with their parents. At first, letters between parents and children were constant and filled with hopes and plans for their reunion. In September 1939, the beginning of the war, the German government restricted delivery of mail to and from Jews, and by 1942, many of the children stopped receiving letters for reasons they would not understand until later. These children showed such resilience and such bravery, and in spite of the separation and the heartache for so many who lost their parents and in some cases their entire families, they went on to achieve great successes in their lives, both personally and professionally. Can you put the picture up, please, of my mother and brother and I? Thank you. So this is a picture of my mother, my brother Melvin and I when we celebrated her 80th birthday. After my mother passed away in 2008, I immersed myself into my book, which was illustrated by my dear friend Gabriella Karen, a Holocaust survivor. The book is dedicated to my mother, and it's a tribute to the children of the Kindertransport. One day, I stumbled upon postcards my mother had written between July 1940 to April 1942. They were approximately 40 postcards. She sent them to her uncle and aunt who lived in Zurich, Switzerland. Perhaps she had been advised that because Switzerland was neutral, they would be able to receive them. I imagine by writing to her uncle and aunt, she had hoped they would somehow be able to get news to her parents that she was well. And in return, she would be able to receive news via her uncle and aunt that her parents were safe. Somehow, which I still have not been able to unravel, these postcards journeyed from Zurich and ended up in an auction house in New York. And the entire collection were purchased by Charles Applebaum, who was a dealer in rare books and collections. Because the correspondence related to the persecution of Jews in Nazi-occupied Germany, it may have been the reason he donated the entire collection to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in August of 1992, which is where they are housed today. I have a full set of copies, and they are very hard and they are very sad to read. All but one are stamped censored pass, and the one you hopefully will be able to view, you can see the censored pass stamped. The next one that Jen is going to show us shows you a postcard that is blanked out, and there it is. The reason it was blanked out is because the content did not meet the strict censor requirements. All the postcards she wrote tell a powerful story of separation and loss, and I will always regret not having stumbled upon these postcards during my mother's lifetime, because I would have so liked to have talked to her about them. Perhaps by talking to her, it would have helped her be more at peace with the earlier part of her life, which I don't think in her lifetime she ever was. During the Holocaust, more than 1 million children perished. And during the course of the Kindertransport program, approximately 10,000 children were saved. And we must never forget the Kindertransport rescuers. One of the most renowned rescuers was Sir Nicholas Winton. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing Sir Nicholas at his home outside of London with my sister-in-law, Charmin Berwald, and Bernice Krantz. Both ladies are dedicated Holocaust educators in London. It was an experience I know we will all treasure, and we have his interview at the museum. But now, without further ado, and on behalf of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, it is with the greatest privilege that I introduce you now to Barbara Winton, Sir Nicholas Winton's daughter, who is with us today from her home in England. Barbara, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Michele. Well, it's great to be with you all. And as we're all sitting in isolation, it's really wonderful to have an opportunity to talk to people across the continents and feel a bit more joined to the world than we might otherwise feel. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my father's story. Some of you will know it a little, I'm sure. But I'll start from the beginning, which was after Michele mentioned Kristallnacht, 1938. Well, what happened was a bit before that, because in the Munich Agreement at the end of September 1938 caused the German army to occupy the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. And that led to tens of thousands of refugees fleeing from the Sudetenland into the center of Czechoslovakia looking for sanctuary. And my father at the time was a 29-year-old stockbroker. He lived in London. He worked in the city. He had a nice life. He was very interested in politics and in what was going on in the world. And he had friends who he talked to about this. One of those friends was a man called Martin Blake, and he went skiing with him every winter. This winter, he got a phone call from Martin saying, "The skiing trip's off. I'm in Prague, and I think you should come out and see what I'm up to." So without further ado, my father changed his plans. And on New Year's Eve, 1938, he arrived in Prague. What he witnessed was a city in turmoil, refugees walking around the town, trying to find accommodation, trying to find food, trying to find a way out. And he met Martin, who introduced him to a woman that Martin was working with, a woman called Doreen Warrener. And she had become, she was a fellow volunteer, but she had become the head of the British Committee for Refugees in Czechoslovakia out in Prague. And she was there helping to get the Sudeten politicians, the democratic politicians from the Sudetenland, smuggling them out of the country because they were obviously high on Hitler's wanted list. And her job was to make sure they weren't picked up by German agents already in Prague and get them and their families to safety. My father witnessed what she was doing and went round Prague and also saw other organizations helping out, giving funds to refugees who didn't have any money. And he also went round the refugee camps that were set up all round Prague. And this was in January. So you can imagine it was cold, it was snow on the ground, and it was pretty miserable. His feeling when he saw all this was that, you know, this was an intolerable situation. And he was already approached by people in the street who saw that he was English and asked him if he could take their children to England. So he spoke to Doreen and he said that he would try and see if he could get the government to accept children to come to England, and if that was possible, that he would try and organise something to make that happen. As Michele mentioned, the government had agreed to a big effort from the Central Fund, allowing children in from Germany and Austria, but Czechoslovakia wasn't included in that. And so after 3 weeks in Prague, looking at the situation, beginning to develop lists, he went back to England and he went to the government and asked them if he could bring in children from Czechoslovakia. Now, he had been told that they would definitely not agree. The British Committee for Refugees from Czechoslovakia had said not to go independently because the Central British Fund would soon take Czechoslovakia under their wing. But he wasn't prepared to wait. He didn't think there was time. And so he went anyway. And the government said, without too much trouble, yes, he could do that. There was an extra condition, which the German and Austrian children didn't have, which was that he had to have a foster family for each child he brought before they were allowed to leave Prague. So a foster family and a £50 guarantee, and he could bring in children. While he was in Prague, he'd met a man called Trevor Chadwick, who was a school teacher, who had been sent over by his school to sponsor 2 refugee boys. And Trevor had met Nicky and heard what he was going to try and do, and said that if he succeeded in getting the government to agree, he would need someone in Prague while he worked in Britain with the organisation. So Trevor was immediately called up. He went back to Prague and he started work at that end. So there were many people helping. There were lots of volunteers in the office in Prague helping out. There were other organisations all trying to get people to safety. And my father soon had a few volunteers in the UK. His first volunteer was my grandmother, his mother, who I'm named after, who was Barbara Winton. And he had a woman who came over who was working with refugee organisations who also came and helped him. So he began to find homes for children. He wrote to newspapers, magazines. There were other people in the UK who wrote to newspapers and magazines also asking for help to do this. People like Eleanor Rathbone, the independent MP, who worked very hard to get the refugees to safety. The Reverend Rosalind Lee, a Unitarian minister, also wrote letters. And before long, he started getting responses and started building a network and a list of children who could come. It was quite slow, so he made cards with photos on, which he sent out when people wrote and said they wanted a child. And it helped speed it up because they could then just choose one, which when he was asked in later life about it, he said, well, yes, it may have seemed mercenary, but it was quick. And he recognised that he didn't have a lot of time. So the first transport bringing children to the UK on his Kindertransport left Prague on the 14th of March. And the day after that, the Germans invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. So despite the Munich Agreement, Hitler, of course, didn't keep his word, as my father suspected, and many others. And from then on, Doreen and Trevor and all the others working in Prague were working under German occupation. So that didn't stop anything. That didn't stop the transports, because at the time, the Germans' aim was to rid Europe of Jews. They weren't at the point of the final solution. And so when Trevor brought his lists of children to the head of the Gestapo in Prague and said he wanted exit visas for these children, the Gestapo head stamped these papers and allowed the children out. As far as they were concerned, that was acceptable. Though he did say to Trevor he wondered why Britain wanted so many Jewish children. And apparently that was the most Nazi-ish remark that he made, according to Trevor. So through the summer, 8 transports left, bringing children to the UK. And by the 2nd of August, the 8th transport had brought 669 children. On the 1st of September, there was due to be the biggest transport organised so far, 250 children. But those aware of our history will remember that that was the day that the Germans invaded Poland. And so they closed all the borders and the trains weren't allowed to leave. The children were all sent home, and after several years, they began to be arrested and sent to Terezin. Many of them went on to Auschwitz after that. So by that time, there was nothing more my father could do. He couldn't organise any more transports. War started, and he went on into the war. He was in doing air raid precautions. He then joined the Red Cross, and he ended up in the RAF. And his life went on. And after the war, he wanted to do something for repatriation of refugees, but he didn't really know where his children were. So he started working for the International Refugee Organization in Geneva, working with them with repatriation and then with reparations. And then he got on with his life. He met my mother, he settled down, and life went on. About 50 years later, he was thinking about this. And one of the things that happened at the end of the project was that a volunteer in his office put together a scrapbook as a memento of all the work they'd done together. And my father had kept this for 50 years, luckily for history. And he thought that maybe there would be some institution somewhere that would find this scrapbook useful. So he started asking around, and eventually he found a woman called Dr. Elizabeth Maxwell, a historian who was just investigating the Holocaust and putting together a conference about it that year. And she was very interested in the scrapbook. She took it and she eventually passed it on to the BBC. And they put an item on a programme called That's Life about this story. And my father was brought up and put in the audience. And during the programme was confronted with 2 of the children that he'd saved, who obviously he had no idea who they were, and they didn't know anything about him. So that was the moment when the children who had been rescued from Czechoslovakia began to discover the story of how they'd come to arrive in the UK. Many of them had had no idea of how they'd come. And this was a revelation to them. And many of them over the years met my father. I think there's a photo which is going to come up now of him and some of the children he met, taken on his just after his 100th birthday in the Czech embassy. It was a whole group of children who came to meet him. So my father died 5 years ago in 2015, and very sadly, but I was going to mention a little bit about why I talk about it. One of the things my father always said was, what's the point of talking about history? You can't change history. It's all done and dusted. We've got so many issues that we need to deal with today, and that's what we should be concentrating on. And I felt that his story really seemed to inspire people. People got very interested in it, very inspired by it, and that it was a useful way of telling people about the history, but also reminding them about what they could do themselves. So I wrote his biography in 2014. I was happy that he was alive, and I gave him the first copy on his 105th birthday. And I've also set up a trust called the Sir Nicholas Winton Memorial Trust, which I'm busy cataloguing the archives for at the moment, so that his archives can be used for research and for educational purposes, so people can, in the future, can look at what was done and understand how it was done and the sort of people who got together and put their lives on hold to make a difference. So I think his legacy today, the main part of his legacy today is that there are about 7,000 people alive in the world today because of that rescue. But the other part of his legacy is the fact that he very much believed that if people took action and tried and made a difference to the issues going on in the world, that they would feel a lot of satisfaction from having a go. We can always feel that issues are too big for us to get involved with: the refugee problem today, homelessness, things going on in our community. But he truly believed that it was better to have a go and take action than to sit and wring your hands. And I believe his story is part of his legacy in inspiring people to have a go and take action today and focus on today's issues using the lessons of the past. So that's my story of my father. And now back to Michele.
Barbara, thank you. And you are as inspiring as your father. And thank you so much. And it was riveting. And if we can all hold our questions, because we now have the real privilege of listening to Amanda. So Amanda, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Michele. And I don't know how many ways to say thank you to Barbara. We had a test run of this live stream on Sunday, and it was the first time I actually got to meet her. I don't know definitively that my father was one of the Winton children, but it seems statistically extremely likely. So I've always included that in the story I tell about him. And it was the first time on Sunday that I got to say to his daughter, thank you for saving my father's life. And now I won't stop saying that. So my father was Charles Susskind, and in 1939, he had a happy life in Prague, playing around on his bicycle there, and no clue what was to come. The initial idea he had was to get out of town to come to the States. And so he and his then young girlfriend had decided they would both try to come to California. They had followed the Los Angeles Olympics the previous, I guess it would have been 32. And they had a dream of coming to this country. They both got visas. She actually made it all the way here. He did not. And so the next best thing was to join his older brother, Walter Susskind, who was already living in London as an established musician and conductor. Walter went on to become the St. Louis Symphony conductor for many years and an international conductor of great renown. But at the time he was living in St. John's Wood, across the street from Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears for British audiophiles. And so my father was able to board a Kindertransport. We believe it might have been the last one. We know it was, he arrived in August of 1939. And as Barbara just said, the last one arrived on August 2nd. It was fortuitous on many levels. First of all, it was the last train out. Second of all, it was about 2 weeks before his 18th birthday, and he would have no longer been eligible as a child. And thirdly, he would have been ineligible because the transports stopped just 4 weeks later when Hitler invaded Poland and World War II really started. So he was incredibly lucky. And he was lucky also to have the sponsorship of his brother, who, as I said, was already an established musician in London. So I don't think he really had the same experience as the very young children. But as Michele pointed out, the older ones also had the disadvantage of perhaps understanding a little bit more keenly what tragedy they were facing and the anxiety of being separated. His initial efforts were to come to the US. He always wanted to come to the US, and he didn't stop wanting to come to the US just because he arrived in London. So he kept going to the American embassy with his American visa in hand, and he kept trying to get on a transport out. But he was advised over and over again, there were no transports out. The boats and ships were all being repurposed for wartime. And it wasn't safe. It wasn't a safe place to try to get across. So he eventually offered to enlist. He said, what if I just, he was told, if you do manage to go to the US, the Yanks are going to be joining the war at any point now, and you'll probably just be drafted and sent back. And so he said, well, what if I just enlist? His choices to the war effort would have been to be in the I believe there was a Czech army in exile, but I think he chose wisely to join the American Armed Forces. Now, my dad at 17 had already graduated from high school, and being quite bright, he had graduated from a school that had specialty in science and engineering. He had already graduated from the technical high school, sort of the equivalent of having 2 years of college here. And so while he joined the American Armed Forces, he was actually ineligible to serve in active duty because of his flat feet, believe it or not. But he very quickly was put on the job of helping with the research for what became radar. He is, as far as we know, one of 1 or 2 or 3 at the most people who were able to serve in the US Armed Forces without ever having set foot on American soil. A very unusual story. By the way, in all of this time, he was trying to get a hold of his girlfriend, and they had completely lost touch. And somewhere in this, he met my mother, not the girlfriend. My mother at the time was British and was about the same age. Actually, they were 4 days apart. And she had enlisted in the Royal Navy as a Wren and was actually recruited by Alan Turing to join his team in Bletchley Park, and was one of the decoders of the Enigma project that is sometimes credited with cracking the German code and ending the war perhaps 6 months early. Some of you may have seen this story in the movie The Imitation Game. My mother, by the way, never talked about her service until that movie came out. And then she was quite livid because of the inaccuracies in the movie. It portrayed them as having much more fun and much more food than she remembers. But this is all an aside. My mother and father started dating, in my mother's mind, quite seriously, in my father's mind, not so seriously. And eventually he felt that he really owed it to the girlfriend in America to leave things be with my mother, and he moved to Liverpool to try to find one last effort to try and find transport out of the UK and to the US. In Liverpool, he ran across an old schoolmate from Prague who had heard from the girlfriend's family that she had gone on to marry somebody else in the intervening years. So my father, when I interviewed him about this very, very late in his life, he said, so I pondered the relative merits of the girlfriend and your mother and decided your mother was looking pretty good. And so he went back to London and picked up where he left off with my mother. And they were married on May 1st in 1945. When they came out of the synagogue, the afternoon newspapers announced Hitler's death which I think they felt was a remarkable coincidence. Because he had served for 3 years in the US Armed Forces, he was able to emigrate to the US, and they came here in 1945 to Pasadena. And because of the GI Bill, he was able to finish his college education. He got 6 free years of university. 3 years he finished his engineering degree at Caltech, and 3 more years he got his PhD from Yale. And from there, he became a professor at Berkeley. So I was raised in Berkeley. My mother thought she had died and gone to heaven when she arrived in Pasadena in 1945. I mean, oranges were growing on the trees in the streets. They hadn't had an orange in years. According to her, she grew 2 inches. She was 23, and she grew 2 inches after arriving here and eating more normally. And not long after they arrived here, they were reunited with his mother, who they had lost all contact with. This is my mom, my dad and his mom, and in Laguna Beach. And that picture is on my desk at the Anti-Defamation League. She had survived Theresienstadt, Terezin, and Auschwitz, and had been liberated by the Brits from Bergen-Belsen and came to live with them in California. However, and for anybody joining from the East Coast, you'll get a kick out of this. When he went to New Haven to go to Yale, she took one look at New Haven and said, I mean, this is a woman who survived Auschwitz, I can't live here. So she moved herself to the Upper West Side, Riverside Drive in New York, and lived there for the rest of her years. Unfortunately, she died before I was born. So I didn't get to know her, but she was quite a force and obviously an incredibly strong woman. My father and mother raised all of us with the backdrop of all the empowerment movements in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, with a firm belief that, yes, one person can make a difference. And you not only can be that person, but you must be that person. So where else would I have gone but to work in social justice and for the Anti-Defamation League? It gives me great pleasure to be able to bring the lessons of my father and of Barbara's father to teachers in the Los Angeles region of ADL through our programs, some of which are in partnership with the wonderful Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, some of which are in partnership with Yad Vashem and the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum, some of which are online. And we're just very proud of the work we do. As we track anti-Semitism and hatred around the world, we do notice that Holocaust denial is a big factor in anti-Semitism, and it's growing. So teaching about the Holocaust and having museums dedicated to the memory of those who survived and in honor of those, the memory of those who perished and in honor of those who survived, as Michele so eloquently put, is incredibly important work. And I'm just honored to be part of it and to be part of today's session. I will echo Barbara's sentiment that we must put this in the perspective of where we are today. A couple of thoughts about that. One is, albeit you're maybe stuck at home, but there are things you can do to help others. And so that's really the lesson of Barbara's father. Don't sit by. There might be something you can do to be helpful. And certainly as we get back to work and out of our homes again, to think more globally about the children in harm's way today, the refugees, the immigrants, children who are separated from their parents. There's a lot of work to do. Children of homeless families and housing challenged, as we go into what appears to be somewhat crashing economy, and many more folks will be out of work. There will be upticks in the number of children and families that are in need. So those of us who can help not only should but must. And that's the lesson I hope to leave you with today. Back to you, Michele.
you are both truly an inspiration, and we are so proud that you are with us today, and we thank you up and down for what you have shared with us and your inspiring thoughts. I think we're now ready to take some questions. Am I correct with this? And there's a question here for Barbara. Before the reunion on That's Life, did your father ever meet any of the children he had rescued? And did he ever try to find them?
He certainly didn't try to find them. He had a good sense of humour, my father. And when he was asked, after the story came out, if he'd gone to try and find the children after the war, he said it would have been rather odd for a young single man going around Britain looking for young children. But no, he didn't really know that this would be helpful or how to do that. But he had met, before That's Life, he'd met one of the children. And that happened because he was a volunteer for an organisation called Abbeyfield, who build and look after homes for the elderly. And he'd been on the national committee, and he had sat next to somebody on the national committee who had a strong kind of Central European accent. And he'd asked him one day what his accent was. And this was a man called Rudy Vesely. And Rudy said to him that he had come out of Czechoslovakia in 1939. And my father had said, oh, I had something to do with that. And I've got a list at home, and I'll go and look and see if your name's on it. And I have the correspondence in the archive. It's one of the things I've got in the archive, which I hope at some point will be online and certainly usable by everybody. And he found the scrapbook and looked at the list, and there was Rudy's name on it. So Rudy actually was there in the audience on That's Life. And my father recognised him. My mother didn't go to that programme because they were told they had to be there in the middle of the afternoon. It was going to take hours. And she said, well, I'll watch it on TV. What's the point? None of them had any idea what was going to happen. So my father walked in and saw Rudy in the audience and tried to get the woman who he'd been placed next to move so that Rudy could sit next to him. And of course, that was Vera Gissing, who had been placed next to him specifically to be kind of unveiled as one of his children. And she refused to move because she'd been told she mustn't. So my father was a bit grumpy about that because he wanted to sit next to the man he already knew. But that was the only person he met beforehand.
Thank you. And I can see there's a question for me here, which is, Michele, what was your mother's experience like with her foster family in the UK? And what was the range of other children's experiences? Well, my mother's experience, she always said she was one of the lucky ones, and she had met the family who she went to live with on a holiday, if you will, back in 1934 in Holland. And after Kristallnacht, when it became very clear of the dangers, her natural parents wrote to what was her adopted parents to say, will you take care of her for as long as she needs to be with you? And they said, yes, we will love her for as long as she remains with us. And of course, she did remain with them. And after the war, she took their name. She was never adopted by them because she was too old to be adopted by them, but she was naturalized by them, and she took their name. And they are, you know, a family that we love and adore, and that love she had has stayed with all of us today. And what I did discover, actually about 4 years ago, I was giving a talk in the Scottish Archive Centre in Glasgow, and I discovered my mother's adopted father was the guarantor for every child that came into Scotland, which is something I didn't know. And it was very much matched who he was as a person. So for my mother's experience, she experienced great love. She lived, you know, she never knew the ultimately what happened to her parents, which was something she sadly had to live with, but she had a very, very loving personal experience. The second part of that question, what was the range of the other children's experiences? And I think, and I don't know, Barbara, if you and Amanda will agree with me, but I think it was mixed. Some children had good experiences, some did not have such good experiences, some went to good homes, some went and worked actually as maids, some went to farms, but in all of their individual exposures, they all remained unequivocally grateful to Great Britain for taking them in. I remember when I was researching my book and I spoke to a lady on the phone from Birmingham, which is outside of London in England. I'm not very good at logistics, but, and she said to me, please don't write it was happily ever after for all of us, because it wasn't necessarily happily ever after. And there were many occasions, in fact, there was a movie and a book written about a family who took in a young girl from Germany, and she went to this foster family who she absolutely loved and adored. And she went as a young girl, and eventually she lost her mother tongue, which was German, and only spoke English. And she was one of the few children whose parents did survive. And after the war, they came to England to find her. And it was a second separation for her. Not only did she learn to love her foster family as her own, she couldn't actually communicate with her natural parents because she'd lost her mother tongue. So in many cases, it was very complicated. And it was very, very complicated for many of the children. But as I said earlier, in spite of what they went through and in spite of the isolation, so many of them went on to make such great successes of their lives, both personally and professionally. The next question I have here is a general question of how many kinder are alive today. So one of you ladies, would you like to answer that question as best as you can, which is a difficult question to answer?
I have no idea. I mean,
it's hard to know. It's, yeah.
I've known many of my father's children who we've met over the years, and I would say of those that I've met, at least 30, if not 50% of them have died.
Right.
And those are, that's just of the people that I've met since 1988. But the eldest are in their mid-90s now, and the youngest are probably in their mid-80s or early 80s. So, obviously every day they're dying. I've just seen a note on the side here of a question from somebody who mentions one of my father's children who lived in Los Angeles and talked at the Museum of Tolerance, Dave Lux. Yeah. And I had no idea he'd died. I just see on the side that he died a few years ago. I stayed with Dave several times when I was in Los Angeles. He was great. And,
yes,
were wonderful people. They did wonderful things, and they had so much to offer. And it's so sad that they're of that age where they are dying. But, they have children and grandchildren, and it's great to think that the second generation are telling the stories of their parents.
Absolutely right. And Dave was a very, all our survivors are very beloved, and Dave used to speak frequently at the museum, and he was an extraordinary man who he shared his story. Many times we were in his home, and he was very, very artistic, a wonderful artist, and he kept his memories through his artwork, and it was wonderful, which Barbara, he probably shared with you a lot of his artwork. But one thing I would like to share with any of our listeners here today who are looking for their loved ones, World Jewish Relief is a wonderful resource, and they have an extensive archive center, and they do hold a remarkable amount of documents and records of Jewish refugees, that especially many of the Kindertransport children. So if anybody is looking for loved ones, I would highly recommend you contact World Jewish Relief, and their email is www.worldjewishrelief.org, and they really are a very helpful resource. So I think with that said, I don't see any questions coming up at the moment. So I think at this point, Amanda, Barbara, is there anything you would like to add? I mean, you've said so much already. So I think.
Well, I was just I did see a question come up about whether parents talked about it and what was Barbara's reaction when she first heard that her father had done this. And I will just say from my perspective, I think it's a quite common thing that survivors and even children of survivors that have gone through something like this, for the most part, didn't talk much, certainly didn't. I had to kind of really interview my father very late in his life. And actually my mom knew more about it than my father was willing to say. So I got more of the story from my mother. If you have elderly relatives who were impacted, whether they were hidden or survivors or on the Kindertransports, why not use this stay-at-home time to do some video chats and see if you can delve even deeper into their stories. Maybe this will be a time when they might be willing to talk in ways they haven't before. So another possible use of our collective global downtime.
Yeah.
And that one final thing I just want to say, and I don't mean to belittle anybody's anxiety or suffering right now. It's a terrible time. But I will say I've had some chuckles at what my mother and father, and certainly his mother, would have thought about our, near hysteria over having to be safer at home and stay at home, where we have heating and fresh fruit and all the ways we can communicate and wonderful television to watch. It's challenging, but let's keep it in perspective of what people have been through in history and actually what people are even today still going through as we keep a perspective on what we're dealing with today.
I think that's a very wise piece of information for all of us. Thank you. Thank you. So to Amanda, Barbara, on behalf of all the listeners and of the museum and myself, thank you both so much for being part of this. It's been very special, and we thank you up and down enormously. Before we sign off, I would like you all to jot in your calendars, if you have the time, that on Thursday of this week at 4 p.m. Pacific time, if you would like to join a conversation with author Tom Tyholtz about his new book called Ivan of the Extermination Camp, How the Trials and Denials of Nazi Collaborator John Demjanjuk added to our understanding of the Holocaust. Tom covered Demjanjuk's trial in Jerusalem in 1987 as a journalist. And if you watch the recent Netflix documentary about him, The Devil Next Door, it was called, you may have seen Tom in that. The conversation with Tom will be moderated by Jonathan Kirsch, who is the book editor at the Jewish Journal. We are working hard to provide compelling virtual programming while the museum is closed. So please follow us on our Facebook page and check our website, lamoth.org, to learn about our future programs. So at this point, again, thank you, all of you, and especially Amanda and Barbara. Thank you so much. And take care, everybody. Stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye all.